The sound of a shotgun blast echoed across the valley as Deanna Chambers ducked behind the crumbling stone wall, her heart pounding against her ribs like a desperate prisoner seeking escape. The rancher's bullet struck the rocks inches from her head, sending sharp fragments flying into her auburn hair as she tried to make herself smaller against the unforgiving earth of Serpent Creek Ranch. "You hear me, woman?" Tobias Fletcher's voice boomed across the pasture, the late afternoon sun glinting off the barrel of his weapon. "You'll never leave this land alive. This deed belongs to me, and so will everything else you've got." Deanna pressed her trembling hand against the folded papers hidden in her bodice, the only proof she had that this land rightfully belonged to her late father. Her journey from Boston to the Oregon Territory in 1879 was supposed to be a fresh start, not a death sentence. "I've got all night to hunt you down," Fletcher called, his voice drawing nearer as Deanna's options dwindled with the fading daylight. "Ain't nobody gonna come looking for an Eastern lady who don't belong out here anyway." The crack of another gunshot made Deanna flinch. She needed to move, but every direction offered nothing but open ground and certain discovery. As Fletcher's heavy footsteps crunched on the rocky soil, she closed her eyes and silently began to pray. Then came the sound that changed everything: hoofbeats, approaching fast from the west. A stranger's arrival that would alter the course of two lives forever. Diana risked a glance over the wall and saw a lone rider galloping toward the ranch house, his silhouette backlit by the setting sun. Fletcher turned, momentarily distracted by this unexpected visitor, giving Deanna precious seconds to slip away from her hiding place and dash toward a nearby cluster of cottonwoods. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his tall frame unfolding from the saddle with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback. Deanna couldn't make out his features from this distance, only the dark shape of him as he raised a hand in greeting to Fletcher. "Evening," the newcomer called, his voice carrying across the open ground. "Seems I've stumbled onto something I shouldn't have." Fletcher lowered his shotgun slightly but kept it ready. "Just handling a trespasser, nothing for you to concern yourself with, stranger." "Is that so?" The man took a step forward. "Funny thing about trespassers, they generally don't have women folks' footprints. Those look mighty small for a man's boots." Deanna held her breath, pressing herself against the rough bark of a cottonwood. The stranger had noticed her tracks. Was he ally or enemy? In this wild country, it was impossible to know whom to trust. "Name's Daniel Dawson," the newcomer said, removing his hat and revealing a shock of dark hair that caught the last golden rays of sunlight. "Just passing through on my way to Jordan Valley." "Thought I might water my horse before nightfall," Fletcher spat on the ground. "Well, you've had your water. Best be on your way now, Dawson. My business here ain't yours." Daniel replaced his hat slowly, his eyes scanning the surroundings with deliberate care. "I've never been one to leave a lady in distress, Mr. Fletcher, Tobias Fletcher, and there ain't no lady in distress here, just a thieving woman trying to steal what's rightfully mine." Daniel's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Is that a fact?" "Well, maybe I should hear both sides of this dispute before I move along. Seems only fair." Deanna's heart leapt at the stranger's words. Could she trust him? He seemed to be offering help, but in her short time in the West, she'd learned that men's motivations were seldom pure. Fletcher took a menacing step toward Daniel. "This is my land, cowboy. You do well to remember that. The woman's hiding somewhere, and when I find her, she'll pay for trying to swindle me." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Swindling's a serious charge. But shooting at an unarmed woman seems a mite extreme, even out here." "She's got papers," Fletcher snarled. "Forged papers claiming this ranch belongs to her daddy. Everyone knows I bought this place fair and square from old man Miller 3 years back." "Miller?" Daniel frowned. "I knew a Charles Chambers who owned land in these parts, had a daughter back east, if I recall correctly." Deanna gasped softly at the mention of her father's name. How did this stranger know him? Fletcher's face darkened. "Chambers lost this place in a poker game to Miller before he died." "Everyone knows that. Now Miller's sold to me and I've got the papers to prove it." "Interesting," Daniel said, his voice casual but his stance alert. Because I remember Charles Chambers as a man who never gambled, not once in his life. The sun had nearly disappeared now, leaving the land bathed in deep purple shadows. Deanna knew she needed to make a decision: continue hiding and hope Fletcher didn't find her, or trust this mysterious Daniel Dawson who seemed to know something about her father. Fletcher raised his shotgun again. "You're asking too many questions, Dawson. I think it's time you moved on." Daniel didn't flinch. "I think I'll stay a bit longer. Night's coming on fast and Jordan Valley's still a few hours' ride." The tension between the two men crackled like static before a storm. Deanna realized that this might be her only chance to escape. Whatever this cowboy's motives, he was keeping Fletcher distracted. She began to inch backward, deeper into the trees. "I don't take kindly to uninvited guests," Fletcher growled. Daniel's hand moved casually to rest near his holstered pistol. "And I don't take kindly to men who hunt women with shotguns. Seems we're at an impasse." A twig snapped beneath Deanna's boot, the sound impossibly loud in the tense silence. Fletcher's head whipped toward the trees. "There you are, you thieving witch." He swung his shotgun toward the sound. What happened next occurred so swiftly that Deanna barely had time to process it. Daniel's hand moved in a blur, his revolver clearing its holster and firing before Fletcher could squeeze his trigger. The rancher howled as the bullet struck his shoulder, the shotgun falling from his grasp. "Run," Daniel shouted toward the trees. "To my horse now." Deanna didn't hesitate. She burst from her hiding place and sprinted across the open ground toward the magnificent chestnut stallion that stood waiting, its reins trailing on the ground. Behind her, she heard the sounds of a struggle as Daniel grappled with the wounded Fletcher. The horse snorted nervously as she approached, but didn't bolt. Deanna grabbed the reins with trembling hands, wondering if she should mount or wait for Daniel. The decision was made for her when another shot rang out. "Go," Daniel called, emerging from the shadows and racing toward her. "Get up." "I'll ride behind." Fletcher was struggling to his feet, his good arm reaching for the fallen shotgun. Deanna gathered her skirts and, with Daniel's help, swung awkwardly onto the saddle. The moment she was seated, Daniel vaulted up behind her, his arm encircling her waist as he snatched the reins and kicked the horse into motion. The stallion leapt forward, powerful muscles bunching beneath them as it thundered away from the ranch house. Deanna heard Fletcher's enraged shouts fading behind them, followed by a single shotgun blast that went wide, pellets striking harmlessly in the dirt far to their left. "Hold tight," Daniel said, his voice close to her ear as the wind whipped her hair. "We've got a long ride ahead." Deanna clutched the saddle horn, acutely aware of the stranger's strong arm around her waist and the solid warmth of his chest against her back. She had no idea who this man was or why he had helped her. But as they galloped away from certain death, one thing was clear: she owed Daniel Dawson her life. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the horse maintaining a punishing pace as they put distance between themselves and Fletcher's rage. Eventually, Daniel slowed their mount to a walk, giving the animal a chance to recover. "He'll be following," Daniel said, his breath warm against her hair. "But not tonight, not with that shoulder wound. We have until morning at least." Deanna's whole body ached from the unfamiliar motion of horseback riding, but she fought through the discomfort to turn slightly in the saddle. "How did you know my father?" Daniel guided the horse toward a small stream that gleamed silver in the moonlight. "Charles and I crossed paths a few times." "Good man, honest. I was sorry to hear of his passing." "But how did you know I was his daughter?" He chuckled softly. "The family resemblance is striking. He showed me a daguerreotype once you have his eyes. Besides, not many women would come all this way to claim a ranch unless they had a legitimate right to it." They reached the stream, and Daniel dismounted first, then reached up to help Deanna down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and he steadied her with strong hands on her waist. "Thank you," she whispered, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what had just occurred. "He would have killed me." "Fletcher's had his eye on that land for years," Daniel said, leading the horse to drink. "Rumors were that Miller's claim was questionable to begin with, but I never thought he'd resort to murder to protect it." Deanna pulled the folded papers from her bodice. These are my father's original deeds. He sent them to me before he died, along with a letter explaining that he feared for his life. I thought perhaps he was being dramatic, but he wasn't, Daniel finished for her. Charles was many things, but dramatic wasn't one of them. In the pale moonlight, Deanna studied her rescuer properly for the first time. Daniel Dawson was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with a strong jaw shadowed with stubble and eyes that seemed to reflect the starlight. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy, denim trousers, a faded shirt, and a leather vest, but something in his bearing suggested he might once have been more than a simple drover. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "Jordan Valley," he replied, checking his horse's hooves for stones. "It's the closest town with a sheriff who isn't in Fletcher's pocket. We can file a complaint there, get some protection." Deanna clutched the papers tighter. "And then what? Fletcher won't simply give up, he'll come after me again." Daniel straightened, his expression serious. "One problem at a time, Miss Chambers. First, we need to get you somewhere safe, then we can figure out how to secure your claim." "Deanna," she said. "Please call me Deanna." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Deanna, then, we should rest here for an hour, let the horse recover, then push on." "It'll be a long night." As Daniel unsaddled the horse and spread his bedroll for her to sit on, Deanna found herself watching his movements with growing curiosity. This man had risked his life for a stranger, based solely on a brief acquaintance with her father years ago. Such chivalry seemed at odds with the harsh frontier world she'd encountered since arriving in Oregon. "Why did you help me?" she asked as he handed her his canteen. Daniel settled on the ground across from her, his back against a boulder. "Your father once did the same for me. I was in a bad way, caught in a blizzard about 5 years back. He found me half frozen and took me in, nursed me back to health over 2 weeks, never asked for a thing in return." "That sounds like him," Deanna said softly. "He was always bringing home strays." "I was definitely a stray then," Daniel admitted with a rueful smile. "I just lost my wife to cholera, was riding aimlessly, not much caring if I lived or died. Your father reminded me that there was still good in this world worth living for." Deanna felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry about your wife," he nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "Sarah was a good woman, been gone 4 years now." They fell into silence, the only sounds the gentle burble of the stream and the occasional snort from the grazing horse. Deanna found herself studying Daniel's profile against the starlit sky, wondering what twist of fate had brought this man to her rescue at precisely the moment she needed him most. After a brief rest, they mounted up again and continued their journey through the night. Deanna dozed intermittently, secure in Daniel's arms as he guided the horse across the moonlit landscape. By the time dawn painted the eastern sky with pale gold and pink, they could see the scattered buildings of Jordan Valley in the distance. The small settlement looked unremarkable, a main street flanked by wooden structures, a church steeple rising above the other rooftops, a few corrals and outbuildings dotting the outskirts. But to Deanna, after the harrowing night, it looked like salvation. "Sheriff's office is there," Daniel said, pointing to a building with a small porch and hitching rail. "We'll go straight there." The town was just beginning to stir as they rode down the dusty main street. A few early risers paused in their morning routines to watch them pass a woman sweeping her porch, a shopkeeper unlocking his door, a pair of ranch hands leading horses to a watering trough. Deanna felt self-conscious about her disheveled appearance and the fact that she was riding with a strange man, but her safety took precedence over propriety. Daniel helped her dismount in front of the sheriff's office, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Wait here," he said, tying the horse to the rail. "Let me make sure he's in." The door to the office opened before Daniel could reach it, revealing a stocky man with a gray mustache and a tin star pinned to his vest. He squinted at them in the early morning light. "Dawson, that you? Been a while." Daniel nodded. "Sheriff Patterson, good to see you're still keeping the peace." The sheriff's eyes moved to Deanna, taking in her fine but rumpled dress and weary demeanor. "Who's the lady?" "Deanna Chambers," Daniel said. "Charles Chambers' daughter. We need your help, Tom." Tobias Fletcher tried to kill her last night at Serpent Creek Ranch. Patterson's bushy eyebrows shot up. That's so. Better come inside and tell me about it. The sheriff's office was sparse but clean, with a desk, several chairs, and 2 cells at the back currently empty. Patterson gestured for Deanna to take a seat, then poured her a cup of coffee from a pot on the small stove in the corner. Fletcher's been causing trouble for years, Patterson said after hearing their story and examining Deanna's deeds. But attempted murder is a new low, even for him. Will you arrest him? Deanna asked hopefully. Patterson sighed, stroking his mustache. It's your word against his, Miss Chambers, and he's got influence in these parts. He shot at her, Daniel said firmly. I witnessed it, and he's occupying land that legally belongs to her. The land dispute is a civil matter, Patterson said. As for the shooting, well, he could claim he thought she was trespassing. It gets murky. Deanna felt despair rising within her. So he can simply get away with trying to murder me. I didn't say that, the sheriff corrected. I'm just saying building a case will take time. Meanwhile, you need somewhere safe to stay. She can stay at my place, came a female voice from the doorway. They all turned to see a woman in her 50s standing there, arms crossed over her ample bosom. Her gray streaked hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her expression was no nonsense but kind. Martha, Patterson said with a nod. How much did you hear? Enough, Martha replied, stepping into the office. Fletcher's a snake, always has been. The girl needs protection and a roof over her head. I've got both. Martha turned to Deanna with a motherly smile. Martha Wilkins, dear, I run the boarding house across the street. Any friend of Daniel's is welcome there, especially one in trouble. Daniel stood. Martha took me in when I first came to Jordan Valley. You'll be safe with her, Deanna. Deanna looked between the 3 faces, all watching her expectantly. These strangers were offering her more kindness than she had received from anyone since leaving Boston. Thank you, Mrs. Wilkins. I'm afraid I don't have much money, but Martha waved away her concern. We'll sort that out later. Right now, you need a hot bath, a decent meal, and some rest. You look dead on your feet, child. Sheriff Patterson rose from behind his desk. I'll send a deputy out to Fletcher's place today, see what he has to say for himself. In the meantime, Miss Chambers, I suggest you stay out of sight. If Fletcher comes to town looking for you, we don't want a confrontation. Daniel nodded in agreement. I'll stable my horse and then come by the boarding house later, if that's all right. We need to discuss our next steps. As Martha led Deanna across the street to the 2-story clapboard boarding house, Deanna felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. In the span of 24 hours, she had nearly been killed, rescued by a handsome stranger, and found herself in a town where at least some people seemed willing to help her cause. Martha's boarding house was clean and comfortable, if modest. The older woman showed Deanna to a small but pleasant room on the 2nd floor, then insisted on drawing her a bath in the washroom down the hall. This town has its share of rough men, Martha confided as she helped Deanna with the buttons of her travel-worn dress. But Daniel Dawson isn't one of them. He's good people through and through. How do you know him? Deanna asked, stepping behind the privacy screen to finish undressing. Martha poured steaming water into the copper tub from a large kettle. He drifted into town about 3 years ago looking for work. Took odd jobs, kept to himself mostly. Then there was trouble. A group of rustlers tried to rob the bank. Daniel stepped up, helped the sheriff run them down. Been respected around here ever since. Deanna sank gratefully into the hot bath, feeling the tension and grime of her ordeal begin to melt away. He told me he knew my father, Charles Chambers, Martha nodded. They had a connection, that's for sure. Daniel doesn't talk much about his past, but he mentioned your father a time or two. Said he owed him a debt. After her bath, dressed in a clean nightgown Martha had lent her, Deanna fell into an exhausted sleep that lasted until late afternoon. She awoke to the sounds of activity downstairs, voices, footsteps, the clatter of dishes, and for a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. Fletcher's rage, Daniel's timely rescue, their midnight ride to Jordan Valley. She dressed quickly in her only other gown, a practical navy blue traveling dress, and made her way downstairs. The boarding house's common room was occupied by several men, ranch hands, and townspeople, by the look of them enjoying an early supper. Daniel was among them, seated in a corner talking quietly with Sheriff Patterson. Both men stood when they saw her. "Miss Chambers," the sheriff said with a nod. "Hope you got some rest." "I did, thank you," Deanna replied, suddenly conscious of the many curious eyes turned in her direction. Daniel pulled out a chair for her. "Martha's keeping a plate warm for you in the kitchen. We've been discussing your situation." Deanna sat down, noting the serious expressions on both men's faces. "Have you spoken to Fletcher?" "My deputy rode out there," Patterson said, keeping his voice low. "Fletcher claims you broke into his house looking for valuables, and he fired a warning shot to scare you off. Says he never meant to harm you." Deanna's temper flared. "That's a lie. He explicitly threatened to kill me." "We know," Daniel said soothingly, placing a hand over hers on the table. "But it's his word against ours, and in this part of the country, a man's word on his own property carries weight. So once again, he simply gets away with it," Deanna said bitterly. Patterson leaned forward. "Not necessarily. I've been looking into the chain of title on that property. There are irregularities in how Miller acquired it from your father." Hope sparked in Deanna's chest. "What kind of irregularities?" "The deed Fletcher holds shows a transfer from Miller dated 3 years ago, and Miller's deed shows he won the property from Charles Chambers in a poker game 5 years ago. But there's no official record of that transfer in the county office, just Miller's claim and a witness document with your father's signature." "Which could be forged," Daniel suggested. "Possibly," Patterson agreed, "but proving that is another matter entirely." Martha appeared with a plate of steaming food, roast beef, potatoes, and greens, which she set before Deanna. "Eat, child. Can't fight injustice on an empty stomach." Deanna realized she was ravenous and began to eat while the men continued their discussion. "There's another angle," Daniel said. "Deanna has her father's original deeds. If we could prove Charles never willingly transferred ownership to Miller, that Fletcher's claim rests on fraud." Patterson nodded slowly. "The circuit judge will be in town next week. We could present the case to him then." "A week." Deanna put down her fork. "What am I supposed to do until then? Hide here while Fletcher continues to occupy my land?" Daniel's eyes met hers across the table, steady and reassuring. "We use that time to build our case. I've been thinking your father must have had neighbors, people who knew him. If we can find witnesses who will testify that Charles wasn't a gambling man, that he valued that land and wouldn't have risked it on a card game." "There's old Jim Harker," Patterson suggested. "He ranches the next property over from Serpent Creek. Charles and he were friendly, as I recall." "And Reverend Simmons," Martha added from where she stood nearby. "Charles attended his church whenever he was in town. The Reverend would know his character." Daniel nodded. "I'll ride out to Harker's place tomorrow, see what he remembers." "And we should check if your father left any other papers, Deanna letters, journals, anything that might help establish his intentions for the property." As they continued planning, Deanna felt a growing sense of determination replace her earlier despair. With these people's help, perhaps she could reclaim her father's land and legacy after all. The next morning, Deanna awoke feeling more refreshed than she had in weeks. The security of Martha's boarding house, combined with the prospect of action rather than simply running from Fletcher, had restored her spirits considerably. After breakfast, Daniel prepared to ride out to Jim Harker's ranch, but not before giving Deanna strict instructions to remain in town. "Fletcher could show up here looking for you," he warned as they stood on the boarding house porch. "Promise me you'll stay with Martha or near the sheriff's office." Deanna bristled slightly at being told what to do, but she recognized the sense in his caution. "I promise. But I won't simply hide away all week. I need to help build our case too." Daniel studied her face, seeming to recognize her determination. "All right. Reverend Simmons should be at the church this morning. Perhaps you and Martha could pay him a visit, see what he remembers about your father." "A good idea," Martha agreed, joining them on the porch. "And afterward, we could stop by the mercantile. Deanna needs a few essentials if she's staying in town for a while." Daniel mounted his horse, tipping his hat to both women. "I should be back by nightfall. Be careful." As he rode away, Deanna found herself watching until he disappeared from view, an unexpected flutter of something more than gratitude warming her chest. The Jordan Valley Church was a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple. Inside, Reverend Simmons, a thin, scholarly man with kind eyes and prematurely white hair, greeted them warmly and listened with growing concern as Deanna explained her situation. Charles Chambers was a God-fearing man, he confirmed, shaking his head sadly at Fletcher's claims. He attended services regularly when in town and contributed generously to our building fund. More importantly, I knew him to be scrupulously honest in all his dealings. Did he ever mention any disputes with Jacob Miller? Deanna asked, the Reverend's brow furrowed. Not specifically, though he did express concern about certain elements trying to push him off his land in the months before his death. He never named names to me, but he seemed troubled. Would you be willing to testify to my father's character before the circuit judge? Deanna pressed. Without hesitation, Reverend Simmons assured her. The truth must prevail, especially against such blatant injustice. After leaving the church, Martha and Deanna made their way to the mercantile, where Deanna purchased a few necessities: a nightgown, some toiletries, and a sturdy pair of boots better suited to the frontier than her city shoes. As they were completing their purchases, Deanna noticed a man watching her from across the store. He was a rough-looking character with a week's worth of stubble and eyes that reminded her uncomfortably of a predatory bird. When he caught her looking, he didn't glance away but instead tipped his hat with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Martha," Deanna whispered. "Who is that man?" Martha followed her gaze and stiffened. "That's Silas Tucker, one of Fletcher's hired hands. We should go." They hurried back to the boarding house, Deanna acutely aware of Tucker's eyes following them the entire way. Once safely inside, Martha immediately sent a boy running to the sheriff's office with a message. Patterson arrived within minutes. "Tucker's in town?" he asked grimly. "At the mercantile," Martha confirmed, watching Deanna like a hawk. The sheriff sighed heavily. "Fletcher's making his move. Tucker's his right-hand man wouldn't be here unless Fletcher sent him specifically to find you, Miss Chambers. What should we do?" Deanna asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "For now, stay inside," Patterson advised. "I'll have a word with Tucker, remind him that intimidating witnesses is against the law, but legally I can't run him out of town just for looking at you." The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. Deanna tried to distract herself by helping Martha with chores around the boarding house, but her mind kept returning to Daniel, alone at Harker's ranch, unaware that Fletcher had sent men to town. What if there were others watching for him on the road back? Her fears multiplied as afternoon turned to evening with no sign of Daniel's return. When supper was served at the boarding house's communal table, Deanna could barely touch her food, her stomach knotted with worry. "He's fine," Martha assured her, noticing her distress. "Daniel can handle himself. Probably just got delayed talking with old Jim Harker. That man can talk the hind leg off a mule once he gets started." Just as they were clearing the dishes, the sound of hoofbeats outside brought Deanna rushing to the window. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Daniel dismounting, but it quickly turned to alarm when she saw the bloody bandage wrapped around his upper arm. She hurried outside, Martha close behind. "What happened?" Deanna demanded, reaching Daniel just as he finished tying his horse to the hitching post. "Ran into some trouble on the way back," he said grimly. "Someone took a shot at me about 3 miles out of town. Got lucky, bullet just grazed me. Fletcher's men," Martha said. "Silas Tucker's in town." "Been watching for Deanna all day." Daniel's expression darkened. "Then Fletcher knows where you are. We need to move you somewhere safer." "Come inside first," Martha insisted. "Let me look at that arm properly." In the boarding house kitchen, Martha cleaned and rebandaged Daniel's wound while he reported on his conversation with Jim Harker. "Harker's willing to testify that your father never gambled," he told Deanna. "Says Charles often spoke about keeping the ranch in the family, wanting you to have it someday. He also mentioned that Miller and Fletcher were thick as thieves, always scheming together." "So Miller could have forged the transfer documents for Fletcher," Deanna suggested. It's looking that way, Daniel agreed, wincing slightly as Martha applied a poultice to his wound. Harker also said something interesting. He believes your father may have kept a journal, said Charles was always writing in it, especially toward the end. Deanna frowned. If he did, it would be at the ranch. I've never seen it. Which means Fletcher might have it, Daniel said. If that journal contains your father's thoughts about the ranch and his plans for you to inherit it. It would be powerful evidence, Deanna finished, but how could we possibly get it? Fletcher would shoot us on sight if we went back there. Daniel's eyes met hers, a plan clearly forming in his mind. Not if he doesn't know we're there. Sheriff Patterson was adamantly opposed to the idea when they presented it to him later that evening, breaking into Fletcher's home. That's not just dangerous, it's illegal, he protested. I can't condone that, much less be part of it. We wouldn't be breaking in, Daniel argued. It's Deanna's property by rights. We'd simply be retrieving her father's personal effects. Patterson shook his head. A judge might agree with you eventually, but until then, Fletcher has possession and the law recognizes that. So once again, the law protects him while leaving me vulnerable, Deanna said bitterly. The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable. I understand your frustration, Miss Chambers. But if you're caught trespassing on what's currently recognized as Fletcher's property, especially after he's already accused you of breaking in once, I won't be able to help you. Daniel leaned forward. What if we could prove the deed transfer was forged before we went? Would that change things? Patterson considered this. If you had solid evidence of fraud, that would be different, but where would you get such proof? The bank might have records of the supposed poker game, Daniel suggested. If Miller deposited a large sum around that time, or if your father made any unusual withdrawals. Worth checking, Patterson agreed. I'll talk to the bank manager tomorrow, but even with that, I can't officially sanction any expedition to Fletcher's ranch until the judge hears the case. As they left the sheriff's office, Deanna could feel frustration building inside her like steam in a kettle. We can't just wait, she said once they were alone on the darkened street. Fletcher's men are already in town watching me. What if he decides to eliminate the threat I pose before the judge arrives? Daniel's face was grim in the lamplight. I've been thinking the same thing. Fletcher's desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. So what do we do? He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. We need that journal and we need to move quickly. Tonight, Deanna's pulse quickened. You mean go to the ranch now? It's our best chance. Fletcher's wounded and probably not expecting us to make such a bold move. His men are watching for us here in town, not out there. Deanna hesitated for only a moment before nodding firmly. I'll get my things. They made hasty preparations. Deanna changed into the new boots and a dark dress borrowed from Martha, while Daniel procured a second horse from a friend in town. They left through the back door of the boarding house, avoiding the main street where Tucker might be watching. The night was clear and cool, a half moon providing just enough light to navigate by without making them too visible. They rode in silence for the first few miles, both acutely aware of the danger they were courting. Your arm, Deanna said finally, noticing how Daniel favored it. Are you sure you're up to this? It's just a flesh wound, he assured her. Besides, I promised your father I'd look out for you if you ever came west. Can't break that promise now. Deanna was startled by this revelation. You promised him, when Daniel's expression softened in the moonlight. The day I left his ranch after he'd nursed me back to health. He showed me your daguerreotype, told me how proud he was of his educated daughter back east, said he hoped to bring you out here someday, show you the beauty of this country. A lump formed in Deanna's throat. He never got the chance. His letters spoke of sending for me, but then I received word of his death instead. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly. He was a good man, one of the best I've known. They rode on, each lost in their own thoughts as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. As they drew nearer to Serpent Creek Ranch, Daniel led them on a circuitous route to approach from the back of the property, away from the main house. Your father's old cabin is on the far side of that ridge, he explained, pointing to a dark silhouette against the starry sky. Fletcher uses the main house, but the cabin's been empty since Charles died. If he kept a journal, it might still be there. They tethered their horses in a grove of trees and continued on foot, moving cautiously through the familiar landscape that had so recently been the scene of Diana's near-death experience. As they crested the ridge, the small cabin came into view, a simple log structure with a stone chimney, barely visible in the darkness. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, drawing his revolver as they approached. The cabin door was secured with a simple latch, which Daniel easily lifted. Inside, the air was musty with disuse, but otherwise, the cabin appeared untouched since Charles Chambers had lived there. A bed stood against one wall, a table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a small cookstove sat cold in the corner. "Look for hiding places," Daniel suggested, lighting a small lantern he'd brought. "Floorboards behind the stove, anywhere your father might have concealed something valuable." Deanna ran her hands along the walls, feeling for loose boards or secret compartments. Finding nothing, she moved to the bed, checking beneath the mattress and frame. Daniel, meanwhile, examined the floorboards and the stone fireplace. "Here," he said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement. "Look at this." He was pointing to one of the hearthstones, which appeared slightly raised compared to its neighbors. Together, they pried it up, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound book and a metal box. Deanna's hands trembled as she lifted out the journal. "This is his handwriting," she confirmed, opening to the first page where Charles Chambers was inscribed in her father's familiar flowing script. Daniel opened the metal box, revealing a collection of documents, letters, maps, and what appeared to be the original deed to Serpent Creek Ranch. "This is it," he said, his voice hushed with triumph. "Everything we need to prove your claim." Deanna was about to reply when a floorboard creaked outside the cabin door. Daniel immediately extinguished the lantern and pushed her behind him, his revolver ready. The door swung open and a shadowy figure appeared in the doorway. "Well, well," came a familiar drawling voice. "What have we here? Trespassers in the night." Silas Tucker stepped into the cabin, his own gun leveled at them. Behind him, 2 more men appeared, both armed. "Thought you might try something like this," Tucker said with a cold smile. "Boss said to keep an eye on the cabin just in case." Daniel kept his weapon steady. "Lower your gun, Tucker. We're just retrieving Miss Chambers's property." Tucker laughed. "This is Fletcher's land and you're both trespassing. Boss wants to see you, especially the lady." Deanna clutched the journal tightly to her chest, her mind racing. They were outnumbered, and even if Daniel could take down Tucker, the other 2 men would surely shoot him before he could turn his gun on them. "Fine," Daniel said after a tense moment. "We'll come peacefully. No need for anyone to get hurt." Tucker gestured with his gun. "Hand over your weapon, nice and slow, and whatever you found in there." Daniel carefully placed his revolver on the floor and kicked it toward Tucker. Deanna, however, kept a tight grip on the journal. "This belonged to my father," she said defiantly. "I'm keeping it." Tucker's eyes narrowed. "Give it here, lady, or your friend gets a bullet." Daniel gave her a slight nod, and reluctantly, Deanna surrendered the journal. Tucker passed it to one of his companions, who also collected the metal box. "Now move," Tucker ordered, waving his gun toward the door. "Boss is waiting at the main house." With no choice but to comply, Daniel and Deanna were marched through the darkness toward the ranch house. Lights blazed from every window, suggesting Fletcher had been awake and waiting for this confrontation. As they approached, the front door swung open, revealing Tobias Fletcher himself. His left arm was in a sling, but his right hand held a revolver that looked steady enough. "Miss Chambers," he greeted her with mock civility. "Returned to the scene of your crime, I see, and brought help this time." His eyes flicked to Daniel. "Dawson, should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "This land belongs to Deanna Chambers," Daniel said evenly. "We have proof that you and Miller conspired to forge the deed transfer." Fletcher laughed. "Do you now, and what might this proof be?" Tucker handed him the journal and metal box. "Found these hidden under a hearthstone in the old cabin, boss." Fletcher examined the items with obvious interest. "Charles's journal, how convenient." He flipped through a few pages, then closed it with a snap. "Unfortunately, it seems these items were destroyed in a tragic fire some time ago." Deanna felt a cold dread wash over her. You wouldn't dare. Wouldn't I? Fletcher's smile was cruel. No one knows you're here. The sheriff thinks you're safely tucked away in town. By morning, there'll be nothing left of these papers but ashes and no witnesses to say otherwise. Daniel took a half step forward, stopping only when Tucker jabbed his gun into his ribs. People know we came out here, Fletcher. If we disappear, Patterson will come looking. Will he? Fletcher seemed unconcerned. Two trespassers caught in the act tried to flee and had a terrible accident, fell into a ravine, perhaps. Such a tragedy. Diana's mind raced desperately for a way out. Every piece of evidence that could prove her claim was now in Fletcher's hands, and he clearly intended to eliminate both the evidence and the witnesses in one fell swoop. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone freeze. Fletcher frowned, peering into the darkness beyond the lamplight spilling from the house. Tucker, see who that is, he ordered. Before Tucker could move, a commanding voice rang out from the darkness. Fletcher, this is Sheriff Patterson. We have the house surrounded. Come out with your hands up. Fletcher's face contorted with rage. You're bluffing, he shouted. There's no one out there. In answer, multiple lanterns flared to life in a circle around the house, revealing at least 6 mounted men, all with rifles trained on the building. Sheriff Patterson stepped into the light, his own rifle ready. No bluff, Fletcher. We've got sworn statements from the bank manager about irregular transactions between you and Miller on the day Charles Chambers supposedly lost his ranch. And Jim Harker rode into town tonight with 3 other neighbors, all willing to testify that Charles never gambled. Fletcher's gaze darted frantically between his captives and the approaching lawmen. For a terrifying moment, Deanna thought he might shoot them out of pure spite before surrendering. Daniel must have had the same fear because he suddenly lunged forward, knocking Fletcher's gun arm upward just as he squeezed the trigger. The shot went wild, embedding itself in the ceiling. In the ensuing chaos, Daniel grappled with Fletcher while Deanna dove for the journal and metal box that had fallen to the floor. Tucker tried to intervene, but the sheriff's men were already storming the house. Within moments, Fletcher was disarmed and restrained, cursing violently as Patterson personally clapped handcuffs on him. Tobias Fletcher, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and a whole list of other charges I'll enjoy reading to you back in town, Patterson said with grim satisfaction. As Tucker and Fletcher's other men were also taken into custody, Daniel helped Deanna to her feet, his eyes searching her face with concern. Are you all right? She nodded, still clutching her father's journal and papers. How did the sheriff know to come? Daniel smiled. Martha. That woman doesn't miss much. She saw us leaving and went straight to Patterson. He was already suspicious after talking to the bank manager this afternoon and decided to follow us with a posse. Patterson approached them, looking sternly disapproving despite having just rescued them. That was a fool thing to do, riding out here on your own. You could have been killed. But we found the proof we needed, Deanna said, holding up the journal. My father documented everything, his suspicions about Miller and Fletcher, his plans for me to inherit the ranch, even threats that were made against him before his death. Patterson's expression softened. Well, that should make the judge's decision straightforward when he arrives next week. In the meantime, Fletcher and his men will be enjoying the hospitality of my jail. As they rode back to Jordan Valley in the pre-dawn hours, Deanna felt a profound sense of closure and new beginning all at once. Her father's legacy was secure and justice would be served. More than that, she had found unexpected allies in this harsh frontier people willing to stand beside her in her fight for what was rightfully hers. Daniel rode beside her, his profile strong against the lightening eastern sky. She studied him surreptitiously, this man who had risked his life twice now to help her, a woman he barely knew, connected to him only through a promise made to her father years ago. What will you do now? He asked, catching her gaze. Will you stay at Serpent Creek? Deanna considered the question. Until this moment, her only goal had been to reclaim her father's land. She hadn't thought beyond that immediate challenge. I think I will, she said slowly. It's what my father wanted, and despite everything that's happened, I've come to love this country, its wildness, its beauty." Daniel nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not an easy life. Ranching takes knowledge, experience. Are you suggesting I can't do it?" she challenged, a spark of defensiveness flaring. His smile broadened. "Not at all. I've seen enough of you these past few days to know you can do anything you set your mind to, Deanna Chambers. I was merely going to offer my assistance, should you want it." The defensiveness melted away, replaced by a warm flutter in her chest. "I would welcome your help, Mr. Dawson. Perhaps we could work out an arrangement." "Perhaps we could," he agreed, his eyes never leaving hers as they rode side by side into the new day. The circuit judge arrived in Jordan Valley the following week as scheduled. After reviewing Charles Chambers's journal, the original deeds, and hearing testimony from Reverend Simmons, Jim Harker, and several other witnesses, he ruled unequivocally in Deanna's favor. Fletcher's claim to Serpent Creek Ranch was invalidated, and all property rights were restored to Deanna as Charles Chambers's sole heir. Furthermore, Fletcher was bound over for trial on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence against him was overwhelming, especially after two of his own men, facing charges themselves, testified to his schemes in exchange for reduced sentences. The day after the judge's ruling, Deanna returned to Serpent Creek Ranch, her ranch now, legally and without question. Daniel rode with her, as did Sheriff Patterson and several townspeople who had come to consider her a friend during her time in Jordan Valley. Standing before the main house that had so recently been Fletcher's domain, Deanna felt a curious mixture of triumph and trepidation. The property was hers, but the challenges of running it still loomed large. "It needs work," Daniel observed, surveying the neglected corrals and outbuildings. Fletcher was more interested in laying claim to the land than in actually working it. "Then we'd better get started," Deanna said with determination. "There's daylight left." For the next several weeks, Deanna threw herself into restoring Serpent Creek Ranch to its former condition. Daniel was there every day, teaching her about cattle management, helping repair fences and outbuildings, and offering guidance on the countless details of ranch operation that her Boston education hadn't prepared her for. Other neighbors pitched in as well. Jim Harker brought over two of his hands to help rebuild a collapsed barn. Martha rode out from town with home-cooked meals and practical advice about frontier housekeeping. Even Sheriff Patterson contributed, helping to round up strays that had wandered during Fletcher's negligent tenure. Throughout it all, Deanna found herself growing increasingly aware of Daniel's presence beside her. His quiet strength, his unwavering support, his occasional teasing that never failed to make her smile even on the most exhausting days, all of it was becoming as essential to her as the air she breathed. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her father's old cabin, now her home, while the main house underwent repairs, Deanna finally asked the question that had been on her mind. "Why have you done all this for me, Daniel? You've put your life on hold for weeks now, helping me get established here." "It can't just be because of a promise to my father." Daniel was silent for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "It started as a promise, that's true. I owed your father a debt I could never fully repay. But somewhere along the way, maybe when Fletcher was threatening you, or during our ride to Jordan Valley, or while we were searching for your father's journal, it became about more than that." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "I've come to care for you, Deanna, more than I thought possible after losing Sarah. Your courage, your determination, your heart, they've awakened something in me I thought was gone forever." Deanna's own heart seemed to stop, then race ahead like a runaway horse. "Daniel, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know you came west for your inheritance, not to find a husband. I just wanted you to know why I've stayed, and that I'll continue to help as long as you need me, with no expectations beyond that." Deanna reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of his years of hard work. "What if I do have expectations?" she asked softly. "What if I've come to care for you too?" The hope that bloomed in his eyes was almost painfully beautiful. "Have you?" Instead of answering with words, Deanna leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief but filled with promise, and when she pulled back, the wonder in Daniel's expression made her heart soar. "I never expected to find love when I came west," she admitted. "I was focused solely on reclaiming my father's land, proving Fletcher's fraud." Daniel smiled, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "And now I think perhaps my father sent me here for more reasons than I realized," she said. "In his journal, he wrote about hoping I would find not just my inheritance but my home here, a place where I truly belonged." "And have you?" Daniel asked, his voice hushed in the gathering dusk. Deanna looked out over her ranch with its rolling pastures, distant mountains, and the tiny lights of Jordan Valley just becoming visible as night fell. Then she looked back at the man beside her, whose courage and kindness had changed her life. "Yes," she said simply, "I've found my home." The wedding of Daniel Dawson and Deanna Chambers took place the following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the valley, and new calves dotted the pastures of Serpent Creek Ranch. The entire population of Jordan Valley turned out for the celebration, held on the ranch grounds beneath a canopy of cottonwood trees. Reverend Simmons performed the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled guests as he spoke of love, partnership, and divine blessing. Martha Wilkins wept unashamedly in the front row, while Sheriff Patterson stood uncomfortably in his Sunday best, looking pleased despite his formal discomfort. "I, Daniel, take you, Deanna, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Daniel vowed, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Deanna repeated the vows, her heart so full she thought it might burst. As Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had been his mother's, carefully preserved through all his wandering years, she felt the final piece of her new life fall perfectly into place. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Simmons declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The celebration lasted well into the night, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. As twilight deepened, Daniel led Deanna away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the creek that gave the ranch its name. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they watched the first stars appear. "Completely," she assured him, leaning back against his chest. "Though I still can't quite believe how much my life has changed in less than a year." From Boston socialite to frontier rancher's wife, my friends back east would be scandalized. Daniel chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly against her back. "Do you miss it? The society, the culture?" Deanna considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss certain comforts. Hot baths that don't require hauling water, stores with the latest fashions, concerts and theaters. But I wouldn't trade what I've found here for all of that." "And what have you found?" he asked, his lips brushing the curve of her ear. "Purpose," she replied. "Independence, a true home." She turned in his arms to face him. "And you, most importantly you." His kiss was tender but filled with promise, the promise of the night ahead, their first as husband and wife, and all the days and years to follow. The seasons turned, and Serpent Creek Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Deanna applied the business acumen from her Eastern education to the ranch's finances, while Daniel's practical knowledge of cattle and land management ensured the operation ran smoothly. They built a new house the following year, not as grand as some Eastern mansions, but comfortable and well suited to their needs, with extra rooms for the family they hoped to have. The old cabin was maintained as a guest house, a tangible connection to Charles Chambers' legacy. News eventually reached them of Tobias Fletcher's fate. Convicted on all charges, he was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. Jacob Miller, his co-conspirator, received a shorter sentence in exchange for his testimony, but was forever barred from property dealings in the territory. As for Sela's Tucker and Fletcher's other men, most drifted away after serving brief sentences, moving on to other territories where their reputations hadn't preceded them. Jordan Valley and the surrounding ranches enjoyed a period of peace and prosperity without Fletcher's malign influence. In their second year of marriage, Deanna and Daniel welcomed their first child, a son they named Charles, after her father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, whom they called Sarah, honoring the wife Daniel had lost while ensuring her memory lived on. Deanna found motherhood both more challenging and more rewarding than she had anticipated. There were difficult days when she questioned her ability to raise children in such a remote setting, far from the doctors and conveniences of the East. But watching Daniel with their children teaching young Charles to ride almost before he could walk, cradling Sarah with such tender care, she knew she wouldn't change a single aspect of their life together. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Daniel and Deanna acquired additional pastureland, increased their herd, and even ventured into horse breeding, developing a line of hardy, intelligent mounts well suited to the demanding terrain of the Oregon Territory. They became pillars of the community, hosting the annual Harvest Festival at the ranch, contributing to the building of a proper schoolhouse in Jordan Valley, and offering employment to newcomers seeking a fresh start in the West. Deanna never forgot how strangers had rallied to help her in her time of need, and made it her mission to extend the same kindness to others. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Daniel surprised Deanna with a gift she had mentioned wanting but never expected to receive: a piano, shipped all the way from San Francisco and delivered to their home with great secrecy and considerable effort. "How did you manage this?" she gasped, running her fingers reverently over the polished keys. Daniel grinned, pleased by her reaction. "I may have conspired with Martha and the sheriff, and about half the teamsters between here and the coast." Deanna's eyes filled with tears as she sat on the bench and began to play a melody she hadn't performed since leaving Boston. The music filled their home, a beautiful bridge between her past and present. That night, after the children were asleep, Daniel and Deanna sat on their porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. Her head rested on his shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, a posture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "Do you ever think about that night," she asked, "when Fletcher threatened to kill me and you appeared like some hero from a dime novel?" Daniel chuckled. "Sometimes, though in my memory I was a lot less heroic and a lot more terrified of getting shot." "You were every inch the hero," she insisted. "You saved my life, and every day since then you've made that life worth living." He turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "It works both ways, you know. When I met you, I was still drifting, even after years in Jordan Valley. I had a place to stay, work to do, but nothing that truly anchored me. You gave me purpose again, Deanna, a reason to build something lasting." She reached up to trace the lines that 5 years of sun and wind had etched more deeply around his eyes. "The rancher said I'd never leave his land alive," she mused. "And yet here we are, on that very land, building a life and a legacy that will outlast us both." "The rancher was wrong about a lot of things," Daniel said, drawing her closer. "But mostly he was wrong about you. He never understood the strength and determination of Deanna Chambers." "Deanna Dawson," she corrected with a smile. "Deanna Dawson," he agreed, kissing her as the last rays of sun slipped below the horizon, yielding to a sky filled with stars that seemed to stretch forever above their home, their land, their shared life on Serpent Creek Ranch. In the years that followed, Deanna and Daniel weathered the inevitable challenges of ranch life: droughts that threatened their herds, harsh winters that tested their endurance, the economic fluctuations that made the cattle business both rewarding and precarious. Through it all, their partnership remained unshakable, each difficulty faced together and overcome through combined strength and determination. Their children grew strong and capable in the frontier environment. Young Charles, who had his mother's intellect and his father's quiet confidence, showed a natural aptitude for the business aspects of ranching. Sarah, 3 years younger but twice as spirited, preferred working with the horses and spent hours with Daniel learning the finer points of training and breeding. When Charles turned 16, Daniel and Diana sent him east for 2 years of formal education, a decision that provoked the only serious argument of their marriage. Daniel feared the boy would lose his connection to the ranch, while Diana believed he needed exposure to the wider world. In the end, they compromised. Charles would attend school in San Francisco rather than Boston and would return for all holidays and summer months. Their compromise proved wise. Charles returned from his education with new ideas about scientific breeding methods and modern business practices, but his heart remained firmly tied to Serpent Creek. The knowledge he gained helped the ranch prosper even further as the 19th century drew to a close, and the frontier gradually transformed into established communities. Sarah, who had her father's way with animals and her mother's determination, developed their horse breeding program into one of the most respected in the territory. By the time she was 20, ranchers from 3 states were coming to Serpent Creek to purchase Dawson-bred horses, known for their intelligence, stamina, and even temperament. As their children came of age and took on more responsibility for the ranch operations, Daniel and Diana found themselves with more time to pursue interests beyond daily management. Diana established a lending library in Jordan Valley, stocking it with books ordered from publishers across the country. Daniel, whose quiet strength had earned him universal respect, was elected to the territorial legislature, where he advocated for the interests of ranchers and farmers. In 1889, when Oregon achieved statehood, the Dawsons hosted a grand celebration at Serpent Creek Ranch, with guests traveling from as far as Portland to attend. Standing beside Daniel, as the new state flag was raised for the first time in Jordan Valley, Diana reflected on how completely her life had been transformed since that terrifying night when she'd first faced Tobias Fletcher's shotgun. "Penny for your thoughts," Daniel murmured, noting her distant expression. "I was just thinking about beginnings and endings," she replied. "How what seemed like the worst night of my life turned out to be the start of everything good." He squeezed her hand. "You always did see silver linings where others saw only clouds," she laughed. A necessary skill for a ranch wife, wouldn't you say? As they entered their 3rd decade together, Diana and Daniel welcomed a new generation to Serpent Creek. Charles married Emma Harker, the granddaughter of their old neighbor Jim, uniting 2 of the oldest ranching families in the valley. Their first child, a boy they named Daniel after his grandfather, was born in the spring of 1891, bringing joyful tears to the elder Daniel's eyes as he held his namesake for the first time. Sarah, always more independent, took longer to settle down. She traveled extensively, even venturing to Europe to study horse breeding methods in England and Spain. When she finally did marry, it was to a soft-spoken veterinarian she met in San Francisco, who was willing to relocate to Jordan Valley to be near the horses he'd heard so much about from his bride. With grandchildren to dote on, and the ranch securely in the capable hands of the next generation, Diana and Daniel found themselves entering a new phase of life, one with more leisure, but no less purpose. They traveled occasionally, visiting San Francisco and even making one memorable journey to Boston, where Diana introduced Daniel to her few remaining relatives and showed him the world she had left behind. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they walked through Boston Common, the city's elegance and sophistication a stark contrast to their home in Oregon. Leaving all this behind for a hardscrabble life in the West. Diana looked up at him, the man who had saved her life and then spent decades making that life richer and more meaningful than she could have imagined. The answer came without hesitation. Never, not for a single moment. In the autumn of their lives, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Diana and Daniel could often be found on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the land that had witnessed their entire life together. Sometimes they sat in companionable silence, Other times they reminisced about the early days or discussed the changes they had seen over nearly 40 years of marriage. "The world is changing so quickly," Deanna remarked one evening in 1916 as news of the Great War in Europe filled the papers. "Automobiles, telephones, airplanes, it's not the same frontier we knew." Daniel nodded, his hair now silver but his back still straight, his eyes still clear and perceptive. "The West we knew is passing into history. But what we built here," he gestured toward the prosperous ranch spread out before them, "that remains. And will continue," Deanna said with satisfaction, "through our children and theirs." Daniel took her hand, the gesture as natural after all their years together as breathing. "Do you remember what Fletcher said that night, that you'd never leave his land alive?" Deanna smiled. "I do, and here I am, nearly 40 years later, still very much alive on what turned out to be my land after all." "Our land," Daniel corrected gently. "Our land," she agreed, leaning against his shoulder as the last rays of sun gilded the valley that had been their home, their livelihood, and the backdrop to a love story that had begun with danger but blossomed into decades of shared purpose, joy, and unwavering commitment. As twilight deepened into night, stars appeared one by one in the vast Oregon sky, the same stars that had witnessed a desperate woman fleeing for her life and the brave cowboy who had ensured she left that very night, beginning a journey neither could have imagined but both would forever cherish.